Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, The Voice for Liberty, at wichitaliberty.org. The motto there is individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and economic freedom in Wichita and Kansas. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, well, just please visit wichitaliberty.org, subscribe to the email newsletter, like The Voice for Liberty on Facebook, and follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. Well, in case you haven't heard, there's a national election coming up soon, and it's occupying a lot of attention. So let's look away from that and talk about some issues that are local and still very important. The city of Wichita has sold the Hyatt Regency Hotel that it owned in downtown Wichita for $20 million. Now, what should the city do with these funds? Well, instead of spending the proceeds on the Hyatt Hotel sale, the city should honor those who paid for the hotel. Those are the city's taxpayers. And this is important. The Hyatt Hotel was paid for with long-term debt, which the city has told me has been retired. And the proceeds from this sale should be used in a similar way, for long-term capital investment, not for day-to-day operating expenses. And in a workshop this week, the city manager and council recognized that these funds should not be used for operating purposes. But the council heard two proposals that are decidedly more like operating expenses rather than capital investment. One proposal, presented by Public Works Director Alan King, is to spend $10 million on street repair over the next 2 years. Part of that expense would be to purchase a new repair truck, which is a capital, not operating expense, but King later revealed that the truck could be purchased out of the existing capital budget. But street maintenance, however, is an operating expense. And a second proposal from the Wichita Transit System would use about $4 million to sustain and improve current bus service. This was presented to the council as a bridge to a long-term solution. And this, too, is an operating expense. Well, since these proposals were presented in a workshop, no decision was made. The council will do that sometimes later. Now, these two proposed uses of the $20 million Hyatt sales proceeds are contrary to the goal of not using the funds for operating purposes. If the city decides to use the sales proceeds in this way, a capital investment will have been sold in order to pay for day-to-day expenses. Instead of spending on these two projects, the city should simply return the money to those who paid for the Hyatt Hotel in the first place. These people are, of course, the taxpayers of Wichita. Now, it would be difficult to give back the funds to individual taxpayers in proportion to the amount they supplied. So what the city should do is to retire $20 million of the city's long-term debt. That's very simple. And if not that, then the city should use the Hyatt proceeds to pay for another long-lived asset, perhaps the new downtown library. Either of these alternatives respects the principle of sound financial practice and also respects the taxpayers. Well, another action this month at the Wichita City Council, a downtown Wichita project received a small benefit from the city, but there was no mention of the really big money. What happened is that the council approved a project to participate in its Facade improvement program. So the city will lend the developer of a project at 303 South Broadway in downtown Wichita $620,000 to improve the building's facade, that is, the exterior of the building. The property must repay this amount through an assessment on its property tax, so this is not a gift or a grant. The benefit to the property is that the city is able to borrow money at a lower interest rate, so this reduces the cost of borrowing for the project. Now, the agenda packet for this item stated, the Office of Urban Development has reviewed the economic, that is, gap analysis of the project and determined a financial need for incentives based on the current market. Now, this all comes from the city's policy on facade improvement projects, which is that the project would not be feasible except for this loan. Well, upon inquiry to the city, I was told that the facade improvement program would increase the developer's return on investment from 7.06% to 8.35%. That seemed a stretch. It did not seem to me that a small savings on interest costs on a small portion of the total project could have such a large effect on profitability. So I asked the city for supporting documents that hold the figures used to calculate these amounts, these return on investments, but the city believes that the Kansas Open Records Act does not allow it to release these records. In the past, however, I have received this information on other projects. So for now, we will simply have to trust the city on this matter. I'm not comfortable with that. And this is yet another example of the city conducting businesses within a cloud of secrecy. Now, here is where the real money is on this project. The cost savings on borrowing $620,000, that's the facade improvement cost, that's just a small portion of the subsidy this project will receive. Through tax credits, this project likely will receive over $2 million in a form equivalent to cash. This property has been listed on the Register of Historic Kansas Places. That was in August. And this entitles the project to a tax credit of 25% of qualified expenses. And with a project cost of $5 million, according to city documents, this tax credit could be worth $1.25 million. And from the National Park Service, a credit of 20% may be awarded. With a project cost of $5 million, again according to city documents, this tax credit would be worth an even $1 million. I don't know at this time whether this project has qualified or applied for this tax credit. But together, these tax credits are worth potentially $2,250,000. Now, not all citizens may be aware of the mechanism of tax credits. In the case of the state of Kansas, the Kansas Department of Revenue will, figuratively of course, print a certificate that says the holder of this certificate may use it to pay $1,250,000 of state tax liability. Now, it costs the state nothing to print up this certificate. And when the Department of Revenue receives the certificate instead of cash, well, the state gains nothing of economic value. The net economic effect is that the holder of the tax credit has been enriched by $1,250,000, and the state misses out on the same amount of revenue. Well, unless the state reduces its spending by the amount of the tax credit, yes, the taxpayers will have to make up that lost revenue. And that's still not all. This project may apply for industrial revenue bonds. This is a mechanism whereby a project may avoid paying property taxes and sales taxes. Now, this property at 303 South Broadway is located within a tax increment financing district, so it is not eligible for property tax abatements. But a sales tax exemption could be possible if the developer applies. And I think that application is likely, as this developer did just that on another downtown Wichita building, also located in a TIF district, but still eligible for sales tax exemption on purchases related to the redevelopment. And here's something else just to know. This developer actively campaigned for the proposed 2014 Wichita City sales tax, offering free office space to the effort. Should he apply for a sales tax exemption on this property, this is just another example of low-income families in Wichita having to pay sales tax on groceries, but well-off developers escaping paying that same tax. Well, at the council meeting, a citizen remarked how this project is good for the tax base. But being in a TIF district, the incremental property taxes from this property will go to the TIF district, not to the city, at least until the TIF debt is retired. And at the same meeting, council member Janet Miller, she represents District 6, North Central Wichita. She noted that the city is not contributing to the project, that the developer pays all the cost of the facade improvement loan. But of a direct contribution to the project, she said, although I would not probably complain if that was a request. Well, note the ease at which a Wichita City Council member is willing to give away cash. But she's really getting her wish. I'd suggest that Council Member Miller read up on the economics of tax credits and of a possible sales tax exemption. She might be surprised to learn just how much cash this project is receiving. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. The editorial boards of two large Kansas newspapers have shown just how little effort goes into forming the opinions they foist upon our state. Well, here's a quote from a recent opinion piece in the Topeka Capital Journal, which is the second largest newspaper in Kansas. They wrote, "If the past year is any indication, Totten is right about the harmful effects of KDOT sweeps on the construction industry in our state. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, between July 2015 and July 2016, Kansas lost 4,400 construction jobs, a 7.3% decline. This means Kansas ranked 49th in the country for construction job growth." And that's the Topeka Capital Journal. Well, here the newspaper argues that sweeps, now that is transferring money from the state's highway fund to the general fund, has led to a loss of construction jobs in the state. Fortunately, there are some institutions and people in our state that will actually look at statistics to see what they mean. And if the editorial board of the Capital Journal had done this, they would have realized they were fed a line of hooey by a self-interested lobbyist. You see, the Totten, the newspaper cited as an authority, is Bob Totten, who is Executive Vice President of the Kansas Contractors Association. His job is to lobby and agitate for as much spending as possible to benefit his members. It matters not if the spending is wise or needed. The members of the Kansas Contractors Association would happily build the proverbial bridge to nowhere as long as they were paid. Now, the Topeka Capital Journal was not alone in believing what Totten, the lobbyist, told them. The editorial board of the Wichita Eagle believed it also. It wrote a similar editorial telling Kansans that over the past 6 years, Brownback and the legislature have taken $2.7 billion in transportation funding to help pay other state bills, Totten said. The result of this loss of this funding has meant fewer projects and fewer jobs. So here, the Wichita Eagle quoting directly from a lobbyist. Now, the statistics that are cited here deserve further investigation, which is what Kansas Policy Institute did in its article titled Media and Highway Contractors Mislead Again. KPI's Dave Trobert reported this. Had the Wichita Eagle bothered to examine Mr. Totten's claim, they would have learned that only 2% of the construction job decline was attributable to highway construction, and that the loss of 100 jobs is less than 1% of total highway jobs. In addition to learning that Mr. Totten was grossly exaggerating, they would have learned that employment for construction of new homes and non-residential buildings showed very nice growth, and the real problem with construction jobs is in specialty trade contractors for non-highway projects. Well, that's Kansas Policy Institute, and I verified these statistics and reported them in my article titled Kansas Construction Employment, which you can find at wichitaliberty.org. And I built an interactive visualization that anyone can use to explore this data. The upshot of all this is that Kansas highway construction jobs declined slightly, very slightly, but the bulk of the job loss in construction was in other types of construction, not in highway construction, as the highway construction lobbyist told Kansas newspaper editorial writers. This is a really sad episode in Kansas newspaper journalism. The editorial boards of two newspapers, one's the state's largest, accepted as true the claims of a lobbyist, apparently without spending a moment in verification. Both these newspapers have staffs of reporters, some of which I'm sure are capable of accessing the Bureau of Labor Statistics to gather a few statistics and perform an independent investigation. But that did not happen. Instead, it appears that these two newspapers accepted the claims of the Kansas Contractors Association at face value because it fit the editorial writer's worldview. That view being that Sam Brownback is bad, state spending on everything has been slashed, and the only thing left to do is to raise taxes. Well, that's an opinion, which is what newspaper editorial boards produce. Now, Kansans know just how uninformed are these opinions. Well, here's some news about schools. Arizona shows that Kansas is missing out on an opportunity to provide better education outcomes at lower cost. Data from the United States Census Bureau tells us this, that the total spending per pupil on K-12 schools in Arizona was $7,500. In Kansas, $9,900. This data is from the school year ending in 2014, which is the most recent data from the Census Bureau that includes data from all states in a comparable fashion. Arizona, so you can see, spending much less than Kansas. So how do Arizona and Kansas students compare? Well, at wichitaliberty.org, I prepared a table holding data from the 2015 administration of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, known as the nation's report card. This is a test that is the same in all states. And for each state, I show the data for traditional public schools and for charter schools. And Kansas scores exceeded Arizona scores in only one instance. Well, Arizona embraces charter schools and other forms of school choice. In 2014, 17.8% of Arizona public schools students were in charter schools. Now, Kansas does have a law that allows for charter schools, but it is designed to make charter schools very difficult to form and run. Plus, the Kansas public school community fights against charter schools. The teachers' union is against charter schools. The Association of School Boards is against charter schools. Those who want to spend more on public schools are against charter schools. You get the picture. As a result, only 1/2 of 1% of Kansas students are in charter schools. Can Kansas then learn anything from Arizona with its lower costs, much lower costs, and higher student achievement? I think we can, or at least we should. Now, in the upcoming legislative session that starts in January, the legislature is supposed to develop a new school funding formula. We need to make sure that whatever is the result, it supports all aspects of school choice, such as charter schools, tax credit scholarships, and education savings accounts. Governor Brownback has asked for your thoughts on a new school finance formula. You can do this by sending him an email at studentsfirst@ks.gov. That's studentsfirst@ks.gov. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. In our first segment today, we saw that the city of Wichita has a potential investment opportunity given that the city received $20 million from the sale of a hotel it owned. So, should the city invest this money? Should it return to taxpayers? More broadly, should government be investing, or should private individuals and groups be investing? It's an issue in the presidential campaign, as candidates, at least some candidates, talk about investing in infrastructure, education, green energy, and numerous other areas. In the following video, Burton Folsom, a historian and professor at Hillsdale College, he provides two examples from history that illustrate the difference between government and private investment effort.
In 2011, a solar power company called Solyndra declared bankruptcy. A company going bankrupt is not news, but Solyndra was not just any company. Its biggest investor was the federal government, which had given it $500 million. That was news. But really, it shouldn't have been. If history is any guide, it was quite predictable. The government is a very poor investor, and always has been. There are countless examples, but two should serve our purpose here. After the Civil War, American leaders were anxious to bind the country's north, south, east, and west regions together with transcontinental railroads. Congress, therefore, gave massive federal aid to build the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, and later the Northern Pacific Railroads. But all three of these roads had huge financial problems. The Union Pacific, for example, was mired in financial scandal from its inception, went bankrupt several times, and had to rebuild large sections of track thanks to shoddy construction practices. At that same time, James J. Hill, with no federal aid whatsoever, built a railroad from St. Paul to Seattle, the Great Northern. How was Hill able to do with private funds what the Union Pacific failed to do with the gift of tens of millions of federal dollars? The starting point is incentives. The Union Pacific was paid by the government for each mile of road it built. It was in the railroad's interest not to build the road straight. The more miles it took the UP to cross Nebraska, for example, the more money it made. Hill, by contrast, used his own capital. To make a profit, he had to build his Great Northern Railroad sturdy and straight. Hill's company remained in business for almost 100 years until 1970, when it merged with other railroads. The original Union Pacific, riddled with corruption and numerous other financial misdeeds, including the wholesale bribery of public officials, went broke within 10 years. The story of the airplane is even more stark. By the opening of the 20th century, the major nations of Europe and America were frantically at work trying to invent a flying machine. The first nation to do so would have a huge military and commercial advantage. In fact, leading American politicians of the day, such as Teddy Roosevelt, President William McKinley, and others, argued that building an airplane was a national emergency. There was no time, they argued, to wait for private industry to get the job done. The government needed to pick the best aeronautics expert and give him the money he needed. That expert was Samuel Langley, the president of the prestigious Smithsonian Institution and holder of honorary degrees from Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge. Langley was already an accomplished inventor, and he had written a highly praised book, Experiments in Aerodynamics. Federal officials gave Langley funds for 2 trial flights. He immediately set to work. His theory was that his plane needed to be thrust into the air from a houseboat on the Potomac River. The big engine on the plane would then propel it through the air for several minutes. When his first attempt failed and the plane splashed into the river, Langley was not deterred. But when his second flight did no better, Langley and the politicians gave up. If Langley, with the full backing of the government, could not solve the problem, people simply assumed that it could not be solved. Indeed, the New York Times wrote that human flight might take 1,000,000 years to accomplish. But to everyone's surprise, 9 days after Langley's failure, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, with $2,000 of their own money, conquered the air. On a beach at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, they flew the first plane. Within 5 years, they had constructed an aircraft suitable to sell to the government for military defense. Langley's subsidized failure was similar to that of the Union Pacific, and the Wright brothers' success resembled that of James J. Hill and the Great Northern Railroad. Langley and the Union Pacific were using other people's money. They did not spend it as carefully as Hill and the Wright brothers spent their own money. As the San Francisco Chronicle concluded at the time, the destruction of Langley's machine should put an end to congressional appropriations of any kind in every field of experiments which properly belongs to private enterprise. That remains good advice. Economic growth comes from entrepreneurs risking their own money, not from politicians risking your money. I'm Burton Folsom, professor of history at Hillsdale College for Prager University.